A subscription to the China-Africa Project's email newsletter is like getting a daily China-Africa intelligence briefing delivered straight to your inbox every weekday at 6 a.m. Washington time. You'll get an in-depth review of everything going on in politics, trade, tech, culture, and more. And we don't just focus only on Africa, but also the Middle East and what China's doing throughout the global South. Try it out free for 30 days. See if you like it. After that, subscriptions are just $7 a month for teachers and students and $15 a month for everyone else. Sign up today at ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Once again, that's ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, U.S. President Joe Biden appears increasingly determined to build some kind of alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the U.S. has been talking about doing this for a very, very long time. You remember back in November 2019, the U.S., Japan, and Australia came up with this, what we now know to be a cockamamie idea, but it was this idea called the Blue Dot Network. And if you don't remember what the Blue Dot Network is, don't worry. Nobody remembers what the Blue Dot Network is, and it turned out to be just another one of the Trump administration's vaporware programs that they put out. Remember the Clean Network? That was another one of these things. And all of them were designed to try and confront China and to really deal with what the White House calls China's malign influence. Now, after the Blue Dot Network kind of was a bust, a new iteration of that idea started to take shape in recent months after the Trump administration left office, and it's coalescing around the Quad. And the Quad, for those of you who are not familiar, is this relatively new coalition here in Asia made up of the U.S., Japan, Australia, and most importantly, India. And there's a lot of momentum now building around the Quad, and that started to really gain speed. Each of these countries in the Quad has a very tense relationship with China, and they're all motivated to find ways to confront China in a number of different arenas, everything from security, say, for example, in the South China Sea, to infrastructure finance, to COVID-19 vaccines. And there was an announcement a couple months ago, actually maybe a couple weeks ago, to produce up to 1 billion vaccines for distribution here in Asia. Then last month, Cobus, a very interesting call took place between Joe Biden and UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and Biden floated the idea of building that alternative to the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, we thought, okay, maybe that's just a one-off, but then the issue came up again this week, this time in the context of Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga's visit to Washington, which by the time that you're listening to this podcast is either happening or will have happened. And based on what we're hearing, it's quite likely that this BRI issue will also be a topic of discussion. So all of that was very interesting. And then I was reading the Washington Post today, and there was this column in the Post by Indian TV journalist Barkha Dutt, who said, if Biden wants to counter China, he needs to look to India. So that now brings everything together. And the situation is becoming increasingly complex, Cobus, and it got me thinking about the role of Africa in all of this and how it's going to play out. What's interesting here is that when we think about how many times we've heard from various African stakeholders how they don't want to be any part of a new great power rivalry, well, the fact is that nobody here in all of these discussions is talking about Africa. It's in Asia where all this is going to play out, and Africa really isn't a primary theater.
Well, this all fits into the kind of renewed focus on the Indo-Pacific, or then the shift away from a purely Pacific focus towards a focus that also includes the Indian Ocean. And one of the complications in this is that different members of the Quad have different visions of what this Indo-Pacific ocean cooperation should look like, and they also draw different lines through that territory. So what we've seen is that some players in these coalitions tend to be more focused on Africa and some tend to be less. I think it seems like they're focusing on Southeast Asia and parts of South Asia as fields where that are very kind of close proximity with China and where China is doing a lot of investment. But it is interesting that the kind of western part of the Indo-Pacific, particularly the Africa's eastern seaboard, isn't getting more attention here.
We recently did a show with Abhishek Mishra from the Observer Research Foundation on India-China-Africa relations, and I really recommend that you go back into the archives to check that out. But given the importance of what's happening, the various summits that are happening, and the scale of what's happening in all the different moving parts between Biden, the Japanese, Boris Johnson, and obviously India and the vaccine dynamics, we wanted to come back to this issue of India, China, Africa, and the role of the U.S. And so we're so thrilled to have on the program for the first time Veda Vaidyanathan, who is a visiting associate fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. She's also worked as a consultant for the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association in Harare and the Sino-African Centre of Excellence in Nairobi. Previously, she was a senior visiting fellow at the School of International Studies at Peking University and also a visiting fellow at the Harvard Yenching Institute in Cambridge. Veda joins us today on the line from New York City. A very good morning to you, Veda.
Good morning, Eric. Thank you for having me.
Veda, there's a lot going on, a lot of summitry, a lot of politics, geopolitics. You are in the U.S. today, and you follow these issues. You work for an Indian Research Institute. You closely follow Chinese engagement in Africa and have studied in China, and so understand that piece of the equation as well. Help us better understand the current geopolitical reality, especially as it relates to Africa.
That's actually a great question, Eric. And I think before we start off, I'm going to take your criticism very seriously. What you mentioned earlier, that usually when we discuss the geopolitics surrounding Africa, you tend to look at the India-China aspect or the China-US aspect or the India-US aspect. So I think let me just sort of start off by focusing on Africa and especially the India-Africa strategy. Let me just sort of quickly go through, what are the big components that drive India's overtures in Africa, and also sort of just highlight who are the different Indian actors, because usually I think the conversations tends to sort of revolve around the state, but there's so much more to India-Africa relations. So let me just sort of start there, and then we'll take it from there. So to start off, I think Africa is viewed as a very important, a very crucial partner in the global south for India. When you read about India and Africa relations, conversations usually start with, the historicity of the interactions, the relationship during the anti-colonial struggles, the Afro-Asian solidarity during the Bandung Conference, of course, the influence of Mahatma Gandhi. But then since then, countries in Africa have become very important partners in India's, attempt to build a democratic global order. This would mean, support in the UN for reforming the Security Council, but also like support for Indian initiatives like the International Solar Alliance or the Coalition on Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So it is, especially in the last couple of years, you see that Africa has sort of taking a more prominent place in India's foreign policy matrix. So you see that with the fact that India set up a whole lot of new embassies in the continent, high-level visits have increased. But the fundamental point is India's Africa relations today is still largely driven by India's need for natural resources, right? So India imports over 80% of its oil and over 90% of its gas from West Asia. So there is a conversation that we need to diversify. And today, a fifth of India's energy imports come from Africa. Interestingly, a lot of the oil and the energy that comes into India from Africa gets refined in India, and it gets sent back to countries like Kenya and Tanzania. So Africa is the second largest destination for India's refined fuels.
But the continent is also an important trade partner. In 2019-20, trade figures stood at around $67 billion. There's investments of up to $54 billion. India also has a lot of projects, over 200 projects in 42 different countries, implemented under various lines of credit. So these are the few components that sort of drive India-Africa relations today. So who are the big actors in this relationship? So the first and obvious is, of course, the state, right? Through the India-Africa Forum Summit, there are several platforms of collaboration, especially of late. There are the India-Africa Defense Ministers Conclave happened for the first time recently. There's the India-Africa Editors Forum. There's the India-Africa Agricultural Ministers Forum. There are frameworks like the Pan-Africa E-Network, which has now been renamed the Vidya Bharati E-Arogya Bharati initiative, where Indian, in educational and health institutions are connected virtually to ones in Africa. So today in the India-Africa relationship, is China a factor? Definitely. But I think in any foreign policy aspect of India today, if it's India's relations with Pakistan or with the US or the island nations or even Africa, China is a huge component. So the China-India rivalry will have an impact on Africa. The US-China rivalry has an impact on India, which in turn has an impact on Africa. So I think this is where the geopolitics is at. It's exceptionally complicated and it's exceptionally layered, and one really must need to look at the nuances to understand the big picture.
When you look at India's current involvement in the Quad, from the outside, it's frequently presented as, well, India has tensions with China. India is concerned about China's rise the way we are, we being, kind of as seen from the US. And therefore everyone, like, India is on board with this and the end. But I was wondering, how is the Quad actually viewed from India, and what is India hoping to gain from it?
I think from India, a lot of the conversation that's coming, a lot of the messaging that's coming out of the Ministry of External Affairs and the government points to a largely constructive agenda for the Quad, right? The language is sort of underlining the fact that it's not an entity to limit a certain power. So if you look at the working groups that have been formed recently, there's a vaccine expert working group, there's a critical and emerging technology working group, a climate working group was formed. So I think all of this points to the fact that we have very important, very critical and issues to sort of deal with, and issues that impact all of us. So for instance, even the Quad vaccine initiative, right, where the vaccines will be produced in India with funding from US and Japan, and then Australia will help India distribute and set up supply chains. So I think this sort of points towards a positive engagement. A lot of the conversation focuses and is around the potential of this relationship.
Are you surprised in many respects that the discussions that are happening about China and the Quad and India in the mix of all that are not also involving theaters like Africa?
I'm not surprised, no, because I think these conversations in themselves are so heavy and are so layered that a lot of these other players sort of become like an afterthought, and they go like, hang on, how does this impact everyone else? So I'm not surprised, because that's, I think, how conversations are usually crafted in this region. But I think it is an important area to look at. And I think that's where people like you and people like me, we sort of step in to say, wait a minute, how does this impact other people? Because it does impact other people.
Let me ask a counterintuitive follow-up question to that, because on the one hand, African stakeholders have been saying they don't want to be part of any new great power rivalry. But there's sometimes an advantage to being a part of a great power rivalry because it means resources are directed to that theater. So for example, here in Southeast Asia, I am fully expecting that we are going to be awash in vaccines. We're going to be awash in development aid. There's going to be lots of infrastructure financing coming from Japan, from the United States. There's going to be lots of things thrown at countries here in ASEAN. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's nothing going to be thrown towards African states because they're not going to be a front line in this new conflict, which is, again, I'm not suggesting that being a front line in a burgeoning rivalry is a good thing, but there is an upside to it because it oftentimes can attract resources.
Right. I think there's an upside to it, but I also think there's a responsibility that comes with it, right? Because I think, Cobus, in one of your earlier podcasts, you're talking about how this would just mean there are more alternatives, right? And there are opportunities for, countries to sort of play two countries off each other, or to just gain separate things from separate countries. But I don't know. I just feel like because Africa is such a deep-rooted partner for both of these countries, I don't think you can just sit back and expect to gain from the tensions. I think there will be some level of support that will be sought. For instance, I think even in international organizations, right? China and India both rely on their partners in Africa. So I think there will be some sort of responsibility on that front. For instance, the ASEAN came up with an agenda for the Indo-Pacific. So I think maybe there would be, support sought from African states on the Indo-Pacific, maybe. Or even in, I'd written about this for the ICS, about how when China creates this narrative in the post-COVID world about the pandemic, or when China crafts this narrative about the BRI, what comes out of Africa is, I think it gets a lot of traction, right? So I think this notion of the benign BRI, or the notion that, BRI has all of these positives, has largely been established because African heads of state have come out and said, no, we want this, and, this is good for us. So there definitely will be more alternatives, and I think not as a primary player in these tensions, thus you stand to gain, but you also, I think, will need to step up your efforts and sort of get your voice heard. So I think basically we'd see more of like hedging behavior, and I think it was the Sri Lankan foreign minister who said, Sri Lanka is going to adopt an omnidirectional foreign policy that is trying to be friends with everyone and alienating no one. So I think you can sort of expect that. Would you agree? I'm just curious if you would agree with that assessment.
I think it's nice in principle to say an omnidirectional, but Cobus, do you think it's possible in practice to do that?
It's interesting to track the language of containment, right, as it comes from different actors. So, like already for several years, we've seen from India like a lot of worry expressed about the BRI, and particularly in terms of the so-called string of pearls theory, that of the idea that India would be contained by a kind of a chain of Chinese naval bases. At the same time, we've seen American leaders like talking quite relatively explicitly about that they see the need to counter the BRI as part of countering Chinese influence. Whereas when you speak to Japanese diplomats about this, they stay away from containment completely, to the extent where they say they want to keep working with China in the BRI. They want to help China to kind of to actually expand aspects of the BRI, but at the same time kind of balance the kind of number of players in the Indo-Pacific region, and and balance some kind of like neutral rules-based order, which kind of again obviously the US spokespeople tend to link that to that neutral order. There is no neutral order there. There's like it's an American-led order or a Chinese-led order. So I was wondering how it looks from an Indian perspective. Is there a similar kind of enthusiasm to embrace kind of the logic of containing Chinese power? Or is it like more closer to a Japanese position where they're trying to move away from containment language?
I think there is definitely an attempt to move away from the containment language. And I think especially now when we discuss India-China relations, I think now it's an especially turbulent time in the relationship. But the border skirmishes that happened recently, I don't think people who have been studying the area are surprised by it. They probably are surprised by the extent of aggressions. But the tensions have been building up over time, right? So this question of containment of China that you're asking now, it comes at a time when India-China competition is sort of really bubbling up. So, for instance, there's been differences over, let's say, regional security approaches, right? We've had reservations about CPEC. There's been disagreements about the Indo-Pacific. There's been concerns about China's increasing influence in the Indian Ocean region. There's also been economic tensions. So India runs a huge trade deficit, but also India has excessive dependence on China for several raw materials, including active pharmaceutical ingredients. You saw Chinese apps being banned in the wake of the crisis crisis recently. So although India and China have worked together before in creating new global governance architecture like the New Development Bank and BRICS, there's also been a lot of disagreements. So I think it was Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon who said that the recent border tensions have sort of really taken us to an inflection point. So now there would be a reset in India-China relations. So I think that given the current tensions, I think there are conversations about how India would be deepening its relationship with the US now. And there would be an attempt to sort of diversify our imports and sort of decrease dependence on China. But I don't think the language would ever get hostile enough to say contain China, because I don't think we can really afford it, given the geography, given the fact that we do share a border and we share a whole history. I think the effort would always be to try and mend the relationship and make it better, and to sort of try and bridge it and to try and come to a common understanding, even when your definitions differ. But I don't think the language would be. I think it would be to answer your question specifically. I think in that sense it would be less about containment, more about cooperation, at least in the official parlance.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at the Wits University Journalism Department in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za.
Let's turn our attention to vaccines, and that's been one area between China and India that's been playing out in Africa. India, up until recently, had a very ambitious, very aggressive vaccine distribution strategy coming out of the Serum Institute of India, the world's largest vaccine manufacturing company. They were manufacturing AstraZeneca's jab and sending it all over the world. Then a couple weeks ago, that all came to a grinding halt, in part because infection rates in India really went up a lot and they needed the vaccines domestically. There was a lot of competition in places like Africa, where Indian jabs are starting to show up through the COVAX alliance and also bilaterally. In many ways, this was presenting an alternative to the Chinese, in part because the US and Europeans have still not distributed vaccines in any large or meaningful number, either bilaterally or through COVAX. So African countries were looking to source from India and from China. The Indians have backed off. The Chinese are actually increasing now in recent weeks their vaccine distribution. How is the vaccine diplomacy, vaccine distribution push playing out in this broader India-China struggle for soft power?
Right. I think it's important to sort of remember that, India has come a long way in this area since the virus was first detected. Because initially, I remember there was severe shortages of, critical medical items and PPE kits and ventilators. But today, India is the world's second largest manufacturer of PPE kits, right? By December of 2020, India had exported over 20 million PPE kits and like 40 million N95 masks. And, today, I think New Delhi has a capacity to produce about 1 billion RT-PCR test kits at very competitive prices. And I think it's also really interesting that the national vaccination drive in India began on the 16th of January this year. But on the 20th of January, the first set of Indian vaccines landed in Bhutan and Maldives and, the neighboring states of Bangladesh, Nepal, and Myanmar. So I think India's vaccine Maitri, as it's termed, has already supplied to 64 million doses of vaccines to 82 countries. And I think that the number of vaccine doses that have been shared with partner countries is about the same that have been used domestically. The intentions are obviously, one could argue it's altruistic, but there's also obviously desire to advance your national interest through soft power, like you mentioned, but also to come across as a hub of manufacturing and also to come across as a major player in global public health. So to that effect, I think that the recent decision to stop, I think that could possibly be temporary because there's been a spike in cases in India. And I think it's only a matter of time before it's resumed, because clearly it's been a priority, right? It's been a foreign policy priority to send vaccines out. So I wouldn't really judge it by the temporary suspension. But how does this play out in Africa? I think vaccine diplomacy is going to be incredibly crucial, especially for low-income countries. What will India get out of it? What does China get out of it? I think it's the same, what we've been discussing, the amount of clout and the kind of support you get from these regions. But is it going to be a critical part of India-China rivalry? I think yes, because largely, when people talk about India and China competing in Africa, I always wince because there's no real competition, right? If you look at the canvas, there's the power asymmetry between India and China is just so deep that there's no real competition in terms of the quantum of resources or the instruments that each country has been putting in place. But this is one area where I think you could actually see competition where you're trying to win over influence with vaccines. So I think it's going to be an interesting space to look at.
Coming back to this idea that Eric mentioned at the top of a kind of a counter BRI as promoted by the Biden administration and by Boris Johnson. How do you expect this to be seen in India? Do you think there's kind of enthusiasm for that kind of idea, particularly in considering that the BRI obviously is so focused on providing a series of goods, including infrastructure, vaccines, internet, and so on, to low-income countries. Do you think there's a similar appetite in India to do that kind of aggressive expansion in the sub-region, or will it be more of a situation of India trying to find a kind of role in there, kind of a more of a junior partner role in there, or would they actually have the appetite for a more leading role?
To be honest, I don't think India has the financial muscle to really spearhead something as ambitious as the BRI. I don't know if many states do, but the reservations of the India had over the BRI, especially when it came to Africa, was the economic viability of projects and the environmental viability, the financial sustainability of the projects. So I think that's where the concern really sort of regarding the BRI, that's where the concerns were at. So I think if you look at the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, right, the initiative that India and Japan came together, nothing really came out of the initiative beyond the vision statement, which is a shame. But I think it points to the fact that the idea that India is willing to work with other eager partners who want to help build infrastructure.
Yeah, but if they're not going to bring the money, and they can't get these things going, what's the point? So the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor launched with great fanfare. Again, this rival to China. The Blue Dot Network launched with great fanfare, rival to China. The Clean Network was just trying to get people off of Huawei equipment. That's a bust as well in many respects. One after another. At some point, if you're looking up from an African country at the situation, you go, they're talking a good game, but it's only smoke. And yet the Chinese are here building the Nairobi Expressway, building the Port of Mombasa, building the Lagos-Ibadan Railway and SGR. I can see what they're doing. The fact is, I guess you were saying it rhetorically, you don't think that the Indians are going to put the cash behind it. Of course the Indians aren't going to put the cash behind it because there's no political will in India, just like there's no political will in the United States to spend hundreds of billions of dollars to build infrastructure for somebody else when your own domestic infrastructure needs to be built up. Same in India as it is in the US.
Right. But also, I think the way you'd approach it is also different, because I don't think India's ever been the country which has ever the foreign policy instruments that India's used has been much more how do I say this? Much more focused and much smaller in scale, right? And I think that's actually where you see the most results too. For instance, they've been setting up these, cement plants in Djibouti and milk processing plants in Mauritania, sugar factory in Ghana. So when I spoke to Indian manufacturers of pharmaceutical medicines in Ethiopia, for instance, and they were telling me about, and one of the companies that I'd interviewed was a first generation company. So they'd found success in India domestically. They wanted to expand overseas. And the first place that they moved to was Ethiopia. And at that point, they were very excited because the Kilinto Industrial Park in Ethiopia was just being built. And they were talking about how, if Indian state could put in resources to get local raw materials processing plants to help them in their manufacturing. So, for instance, one of the things that they mentioned was maize, right? Maize is used, starch is used in pharma companies, but they had to import a lot of the maize. So they were saying, is there any way you can write in your policy recommendations and say that, if can the Indian state or some companies come and set up a maize process? So I feel like there's a lot of potential in the smaller aspects. You don't have to build a port or a huge railway line or roads, right, to impact communities. So when India is talking about, our importance and our focus is human-centric development cooperation, then there are smaller areas where you could impact, where you don't need huge quantum of resources. You have the resources to pull that off. Then let's focus on that. Let's focus on what we can do. Let's focus on where our strengths lie. And similarly, like for instance, I was talking to the CEO of ZAF Pharmaceuticals, and she had gotten into a joint venture with 2 Chinese firms. And she was saying, for instance, that, we can produce the heart in gelatin capsules that they were producing, but we don't have places to store these temperature-controlled rooms at the airport or leading to the airport. So there's a lot of potential in allied industries, right? So there's a lot of potential So with China building these mega infrastructure projects, players like India, there is opportunities that come from these mega infrastructure projects, right? So a lot of the, for instance, the manufacturers that met in Tanzania and Kenya were of Indian origin, of Indian descent. They had gotten into cement manufacturing and concrete, providing concrete or providing contracts on Tata tipper lorries. So there's a lot of opportunity to operate even in areas where big projects are happening. So I feel like when your strength hasn't been these mega projects, it's one thing to ideate geopolitically, and I think that should go on as well. I think India and Japan should, if AAGC didn't work, then we should figure out other ways in which we can leverage strengths. If you don't have the money, find someone else who has the money, then you bring in the human capacity or the skill sets that you can bring to the table. But at the same time, do what has been working, right? Focus on the smaller projects, focus on directly impacting communities, because that's been building us goodwill for decades, and that's clearly worked.
I was wondering how the current border tensions between China and India are impacting the wider cooperation between the two. Is because I can kind of imagine that it, on the one hand, it could have a chilling effect. On the other hand, I can also imagine that it's kind of siloed, and business is business, kind of, that people would still be willing to pursue business opportunities. I guess a similar kind of situation is also, the relationship between China and India within the BRICS bloc, where again, kind of they have all of this tension between them, but they also have to cooperate within the BRICS. So how are the tensions impacting the wider cooperation between the two?
Some time ago, I think there was division in how people saw this relationship, right? Oh, that's politics, what's happening at the border, that's different, business is business, because like you mentioned, it's a huge trade partner for India. We have a lot of interest in the Chinese economy, and I think the growth of the Chinese economy would mean positives for India as well. But however, in the recent clashes that happened in Ladakh, there's sort of been a shift in tone, right? Saying, wait, no, business isn't business. We can't possibly operate in silos. So I think the decision to ban over 200 Chinese apps, the decision to sort of move away from importing from goods from China, the call for a boycott for Chinese products, a general a very emotional reaction to the skirmish that happened. So I think it's going to fundamentally alter China-India relations in the near future. But that said, like I mentioned before, I don't think it would be wise or even possible to say that, it's a hostile country or we need to contain China. I don't think that kind of language would ever sort of come into mainstream conversation. But I think one factor that's not going to change is as China becomes more powerful and it becomes, an increasingly important player globally, it is going to be a factor in India's foreign policy matrix. So how China is growing, what China is doing is going to impact and inform. And I think India is going to be very aware of what it's doing in Africa, in Southeast Asia, with the US, in the island nations. So going forward, any aspect of India's foreign policy is going to be informed by China. And that's where conversations like this, where we talk about it might not be as obvious like in a place like Africa, but it's definitely going to inform the relationship.
So fascinating. I'm so glad we had a chance to, again, look beyond the immediate issues to some of the broader, deeper historical issues and how they're playing out among India, China, the United States, the Quad, and of course in Africa. Veda Vaidyanathan is a visiting associate fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Veda, I see that you're very active on Twitter. Tell everybody where they can find you and so they can follow what you're reading and writing.
I have recently started getting back on Twitter, and you can find me at Veda VN.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put a link to your Twitter handle in the show notes. And thank you so much for taking the time this morning to help us sort out everything that's going on. We really appreciate it.
I don't know if you sorted out everything, but this conversation was fun. Thank you so much, Cobus and Eric.
Cobus, it's so important every once in a while for us to kind of break our format and to have people like Veda come on to force us to think outside of our normal discussion about Africa and China, Africa and whatnot, because to see that bigger picture of what the relationship and the complexity of the relationship between India, China, it will bear out in Africa the same way that the U.S.-China relationship is going to bear out in Africa. But I do want to come back to my point about the fact that there are sometimes a benefit to being a contested space because of resources and attention. And I think what I'm seeing now more and more in Washington and here in Asia is that the attention is being focused in Southeast Asia. And the biggest concern that I had about the Chinese in Africa for many years was not that the Chinese were going to be neo-imperial colonial overlord that was going to take over Africa. The bigger concern and the bigger threat was that they get bored and they leave. And that is what we have seen from the United States for a steady 10 plus, maybe 15 years. We have not seen a major American program for Africa since PEPFAR. It's remarkable. And that was, 20 years ago. We're living on fumes on Africa policy in the United States. And I get the feeling that the same might be happening with the Chinese, that they are going to shift their strategy from large-scale infrastructure development to more elite capture, digital, health. These lighter footprint type of projects because the emphasis is going to shift to other parts of the world, namely the Persian Gulf and Southeast Asia and the Americas. But Africa is not really on the agenda right now in a lot of these discussions about great power politics.
I don't know that I'd necessarily go that far because there's still a lot of concern in all of these places about China's involvement in Africa. I agree with you that I think China might shift its emphasis on what it focuses on, and that shift might well be somewhat of a shift away from a hard infrastructure. But at the same time, in a recent podcast, Deborah Brautigam pointed out that Africa still makes up 30% of China's total international construction business.
It's a big part. There's no doubt.
So that's a significant chunk. And it also is it's a long-term investment, a long-term presence. What I think I think it's a lot of this is gonna in some kind of ways. I think Africa receiving some attention, but not the full blinding, kind of obsession of all of these different players, particularly not as it's filtered through their own anxieties about the rise of China. That kind of having a little bit of breathing space might well be beneficial for Africa, because one of Africa's problems in the past has been overly interventionist, external partners who don't let African governments make their own decisions. So in that sense, kind of being kind of on the margin, but still kind of grabbing some of the resources may well kind of end up being not so bad.
And there's an interesting story that ran this week that we showcased in our newsletter about the U.S. Exim Bank loan to Mozambique. And this was a $4.7 billion loan that they issued last year. And the point here is that the focus on China has led to terrible policymaking and terrible decisions in Washington. So Kimberly Reed, who is the former chairwoman of the U.S. Exim Bank, was really just a Trump devotee. And they passed through this $4.7 billion loan over concerns. They ignored the concerns about the insurgency in northern Mozambique. This was a very risky deal. But in the press release to announce the loan, China, 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 China. This was about confronting China. This was to make sure that China did not swoop in to have a big stake of that gas pipeline. And what it did is it led to bad decisions being made. And so if the focus in Africa was to confront China and so focused on China, then lots of bad policymaking would happen, as was the case with the U.S. Exim Bank loan in Mozambique. And this highlights that that could be disadvantageous for Africa as well. So the fact is that maybe as you're right, if the temperature dials down in Africa as the big powers are focusing elsewhere, it might allow space for maybe smaller policies, but more effective policies.
Yes, hopefully, and I think if China decides to shift towards more medical, more kind of digital and other forms of outreach rather than kind of traditional hard infrastructure, there's a lot of scope for that in Africa. In fact, I think some economists have made the point that kind of having more internet is itself probably one of the biggest growth factors in for African economies. So so in that sense, that's okay. What I kind of tend to worry about a little bit is that there's such a focus on this kind of this idea of trying to counter China that there is a little bit of a lack of attention to the fact that the way that China rolled out its international presence was on the back of certain very strong capabilities that it had. Particularly the need for Chinese state-owned enterprises to work overseas and this kind of overcapacity in certain kinds of infrastructure provision in China. So, that makes sense from a Chinese perspective. What I'm wondering is what is a similar kind of set of strengths that the US wants to roll out and that it feels will kind of improve the world. That I'm still a little unclear about. Like what is exactly the vision that the US wants to bring to the rest of the world, and particularly to Southeast Asia and the Gulf states and kind of Middle East and Africa. More than simply we need to do something because China is doing stuff. That is a little unclear for me still.
Everything you hear coming out of the United States is aspirational. We should bring more African students to the United States. We should do more trade. We should do more tech investing and get American companies to go over to Africa. Everything is future tense aspirational. Meantime, the level of U.S. trade with Africa continues to slump more and more and more. There are no new big initiatives or programs. And if the United States really wants to confront the Chinese and challenge the Chinese in Africa, they're going to have to do it by actually delivering results and doing something, rather than have one meeting, one marketing plan, one announcement, one Senate hearing after another, where nothing is done other than these aspirational types of visions that are put forward. We should do this.
Well, for that reason, I think it will be very interesting, particularly in this field, the fact that they're particularly working with Japan and India. I think Australia is to a large extent on very the same page as the US. I think in many of these issues, but I think both Japan and India bring very different sets of priorities to the table, and they also bring pre-existing relationships with the global South to the table. Like Japan is a big player in Africa, and there's even much bigger player, as obviously in Southeast Asia, and so so like they bring kind of levels of capabilities, and they also bring a certain kind of approaches, I think, to dealing with these countries that will be an interesting mix if they can find a way of doing it together. At this moment, I'm still not sure what they're actually planning. And I wonder whether they have moved in that direction in their discussions.
You're absolutely right about the Japanese, because here in Ho Chi Minh City, it's the Japanese who are building the subway. you see Japanese. I mean, the same way that you see in Africa Chinese construction all over the place, we see it here in Japan doing it, where you see Japanese flags flying all throughout the city to build the subway. We see Japanese construction cranes building towers and things like that. So the Japanese presence here is very, very visible and very welcome, by the way. And that's the case throughout Southeast Asia as well. So the Japanese, unlike the Americans in many ways, are delivering on the ground. And it will be interesting, again, if that kind of translates the Quad into it. But I think, to your point, because the Indians and Japanese have such divergent interests, remember, India has never been a country that aligns itself with one side or the other. They've always felt more comfortable in the middle, between the East and the West. In fact, during the Cold War, they were more aligned with the Soviets. Modi has been very much kind of open to engaging more with the Americans. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure that any American president should trust a relationship with India only because India has been able to chart such an autonomous, independent foreign policy. And that may not necessarily always align with American objectives. Japan as well, because Japan is not as strident necessarily on some of the human rights issues, for example, that the United States are concerned about in China. So there's a lot of divergence in some of those areas in terms of what the Japanese are thinking about vis-a-vis China. So to your point, I think the Quad is a marriage of convenience right now, but it's not necessarily as unified as I think a lot of people on the outside look at it.
I think, you really kind of hit an interesting point there. I think, I agree with you that India charts this opposite course, or there's this different course. And I think to a large extent that approach is a Southern approach. I think we're moving more and more in a direction where it becomes like too simplistic. I mean, it's always simplistic to talk about East versus West, but to only have that division and not have the more attention on the North-South division, I think is a problem. And I think India is a key example. The fact that India, for example, was such a big player with South Africa and trying to force like northern drug companies to give up IP regulations in order to mass produce the vaccines. That is an example of that approach. It's an approach that South Africa follows to much less effect than India. But it is exactly this kind of we're not in your camp, we're in our own camp kind of approach that I think is gonna be an emerging approach as global South governments get stronger and stronger over the next few years.
Veda mentioned that about Sri Lanka, that they're taking this omni-channel approach, and you see the Sri Lankans engaging Chinese, Indians, and the Americans. Very interesting approach. That is the way that they're doing it here in Vietnam and in Kenya as well. We just focused on Kenya a couple weeks ago, talking to Elijah Munyi, a professor at United States International University, where he also said that the Kenyans are navigating both sides. So I think you're right. That is a global South strategy. Our good friend Jude Moore at the Center for Global Development in Washington, he talks about that as well, how they want to get countries like Kenya want to be able to maximize the relationship with all the major powers and to avoid as much as possible from taking a side in any of these conflicts. So they just want to keep their head down and focus on many of the more pressing, immediate needs that they have in terms of generating employment, getting over the pandemic, and getting their economies back on track. Ideology does not fit into that in terms of global geopolitics. So that's very interesting. So we did a little bit of a different show today, where we kind of stepped out again out of the normal realm that we're in. Hope that you found it interesting. We'll do this from time to time just because we're interested in these broader, bigger issues. These are some of the issues that we also focus on in our newsletter. And I go back to this great column that Cobus wrote a couple of months ago. When was that, Cobus? That was about 2 or 3 months ago, where we kind of started to pivot the China-Africa project into a broader focus on China and the global South, only because we really can't look at Africa in isolation of the other regions. And I thought today, Cobus, that the conversation was very relevant to that post you wrote.
Yeah, I think so. It's like, what China like road tested in Africa, they're rolling out in other places. What they road tested in other parts of the global south, they're also rolling out in Africa. Like they're facing a lot of similar problems. Frequently, it's a lot of similar companies working on similar projects in lots of different places. So it makes sense to bring everyone into conversation.
I'll tell you that the pace of activity in the Persian Gulf has gone up a lot with the Chinese, especially after the Wang Yi visit, the deal with Iran, the new vaccine deal that they're producing Sinopharm vaccines in the United Arab Emirates. Vaccines just landed in the Palestinian territories, Lebanon and Syria as well. The Chinese are very active now in the Persian Gulf, Middle East area. So that's one of the areas that we're focusing on in our daily newsletter. We'd love for you to join our growing community of readers around the world. We have a great audience in Asia, the Americas, Africa, and Europe who subscribe to the newsletter. It's only $7 a month for students and teachers, $15 a month for everybody else. But basically what Cobus and I are doing is taking the conversation we had today with Veda, and we kind of bring that into a newsletter every day where it's a digest of everything that China's doing in Africa, the Middle East, and to more and more into the global south. Go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Use the promo code podcast and we'll take 20% off your subscription for life. So that is, if you subscribe year after year, it'll still be the same low rate minus 20%. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. Or follow the guys on Twitter. Eric's at Eolanda, and you can find Cobus at Stadenesque. For more information about the China Africa Project and to sign up for our free weekly email news brief, go to ChinaAfricaProject.com.